Hello there, this is the video for the 1.05 progressive lesson, and let's begin. People who call themselves progressives didn't share a specific political platform, but they all agreed that reforms were needed and that progress could be made. Some worked against political corruption and some tried to end child labor. Other progressives wanted to dismantle monopolies, improve urban life, educate the poor, or gain women's rights. Some were politicians, others were journalists, authors, or social workers who shared a common goal, a better life for all. Goals for this lesson. Describe the unifying goal of the progressive movement. Describe muckrakers, including Ida Tarbell and Upton Sinclair, and their role in reform, and summarize political reforms that came about as a result of the progressive movement. Remember, in the past lessons we were talking about some of the problems in the cities. We've talked about the social Darwinism, that concept, where some people were against helping those in need. And the last lesson was talking about the populist movement, and particularly the problems facing farmers in this time in U.S. history. Okay, today's lesson we have to read pages 569 through 576. Work on the reading guide, the virtual field trip activity, which is actually part of our graded assignment that you'll be working on today, so more about that coming up, and then of course the graded assignment itself. Remember to grab your reading guide and or lesson answer key here. The reading guide, lesson answer key, you can get them both from the lesson resources tab. Fill out the reading guide as we go through the reading and check your answers with the lesson answer key at the end. Okay, let's begin. So 569. Here we are on page 569. Starting with the progressive reform. While the populists mainly focused on the problems of rural America, other reformers aimed to improve urban conditions and clean up corruption in business and government. As previous chapters have described, many city dwellers lived in poverty, rarely earning even enough to get by. Industrial workers faced countless hardships and dangers, and like farmers, found little help from the government. At the dawn of the 20th century, as city and factory conditions worsened, and as politics grew more corrupt, reformers from around the country took action to address the mounting social, economic, and political problems. These reformers were often called progressives. Not to be confused with the Progressive Insurance Agency and the spokesperson Flo. Sorry, had to throw that joke in there. In many ways, progressives were more at peace with the modern world than their populist forerunners. They accepted the rise of large corporations, big cities, and immigration. Instead of trying to turn the clock back to a simpler time, they hoped to reform modern America by imposing rules and order on a largely unchecked capitalist system. And that's, remember the difference? Like they said, different from the populists were hoping to go back to an easier way. But the progressives were more mindful that things weren't going to change, that this is a modern era, things are changing, and we have to make accommodations and adjustments for that. We can't just hope for different ways. We have to go forward with the way it is now. Before we go on, let's look at the picture here. Urban poverty, a child rummages through trash. So that's just a good picture to show, the conditions in the city, just the utter poverty and hardships faced by many. In many ways, progressives were more at peace with the modern world than their populist forerunners. I read that already, sorry. Progressive reformers were not part of a single unified movement. People who called themselves progressive disagreed on many issues. They addressed a wide range of problems from urban poverty to public health to environmental conservation. They tried varying approaches from scientific analysis to living among the poor. Some focused on moral reform of individuals, while others sought to transform political or financial institutions. While progressives formed at best a loose and shifting coalition, they did share a sense of the urgent need for reform to address the problems of modern industrial society. And most believe that government must abandon its laissez-faire ways and instead become, as one reformer put it, an agency of human welfare, an active agent in the creation of a more just society. And remember, laissez-faire means leave it alone. The concept of leave things alone, hands off. Here's a picture. Evangeline Booth seeks donations for the Salvation Army. And we're going to read about the formation of the Salvation Army here. I'm sure many of you are familiar around the holiday season with the Red Cattle Campaign with the Salvation Army. Early beginnings here at the turn of the century. The social gospel. Some progressive reformers were motivated in part by changing religious attitudes. They rejected the religious complacency of the Gilded Age, when many mainstream, middle-class Protestant churches had turned from preaching about sin and salvation to a message of prosperity and happiness. As large middle-class congregations moved from the inner cities to the suburbs, some pastors endorsed social Darwinist ideas, blaming the poor for their own downtrodden condition. In contrast to this self-satisfied doctrine, new groups formed that placed more emphasis on the need for Christians to engage in community service. For example, in March 1880, 8 British citizens, members of the Salvation Army, recently founded in London, arrived in New York. Within a decade, Salvation Army leaders William and Evangeline Booth were dispatching street ministers not only to preach their gospel of salvation, but also to promote social justice by providing food and shelter to the poor in urban slums across the United States. The Salvation Army was one among several groups and individuals associated with what has come to be called the social gospel. Leaders of the social gospel movement argued that Christians should apply their faith to social action by working to solve the problems of modern industrial society. Okay, this important concept, social gospel, because you're going to hear more about social Darwinism and social gospel. And don't confuse the two, because they're not anywhere near the same other than having social as the first word in there. Social gospel movement says that to be a good Christian, you need to do good things, to help others. Applying your faith to social action, doing good, volunteering, helping out. The social gospel found popular expression in a best-selling novel published in 1897, In His Steps by Charles M. Sheldon. Sheldon challenged his readers to ask, what would Jesus do to help solve earthly problems? His characters answered this question by devoting themselves to improving the lives of the less fortunate. They quit their jobs to undertake charitable work, paid higher wages to employees, moved to slums to help the poor, and exposed illegal activities that blighted their communities. Some religious leaders turned the social gospel into action. In Ohio, Washington Gladden announced that the essence of Christianity lay in the principle to love thy neighbor as thyself. He led a crusade to alleviate poverty, regulate big business, and enact worker protections. Walter Rauschenbusch, a Baptist and a professor at a seminary in New York, argued that churches must devote themselves to nothing less than the Christian transfiguration of the social order. So that's a big difference from the social Darwinism. Social Darwinism was saying that the fittest will survive. Do not help the weak, because that's just making more weak people in the world. You're not making them better by just helping the weak. Only the fit should survive. Whereas the social gospel was saying it is the right thing to do to help all people. Settlement houses. Social gospel attitudes influenced many progressive reformers, including pioneers of the settlement house movement in the United States. Settlement houses, located in poor urban neighborhoods, were staffed by workers who provided education, nutritional aid, healthcare assistance, home economics and English language instruction, and arts and crafts programs to urban workers, many of whom were immigrants. Most settlement house workers were middle-class women, which is interesting to note. Many were college graduates who were faced with limited career choices but determined to play a role in public life. At settlement houses, these women lived among immigrants in the slums in order to help lift them out of poverty. In 1889, Vida Scudder, a graduate of Smith College, helped establish the College Settlement in New York, among the first settlement houses in the United States. Not long after, Jane Addams, she's an important person to remember, keep note of that, Jane Addams moved to an aging mansion in a poor Chicago neighborhood and founded the Hull House, which became the nation's most important and most influential settlement house. Addams understood that if she and her colleagues were to help, they would have to get involved in the day-to-day lives of the people in the neighborhood. From the first, she wrote, it seemed understood that we were ready to perform the humblest neighborhood services. We were asked to wash the newborn babies and to prepare the dead for burial, to nurse the sick and to mind the children. See the historical close-up at the end of this chapter for an account of Jane Addams and the Hull House. Florence Kelly, who worked at Hull House, embodied the reform spirit. She led the settlement's labor bureau, helping immigrant women find jobs as domestic workers. She also mounted a campaign to ban sweatshops where women and children toiled in inhumane conditions. Kelly convinced Illinois lawmakers to adopt many other reforms, from regulating child labor to inspecting factory abuses. After progressive actions helped elect a pro-reform governor, Kelly was appointed to the state's first female factory inspector. And here's a picture of work in action at the Hull House. Regarding the experience of living and working at Hull House, Florence Kelly reported that she was often asked whether all that the house undertakes could not be accomplished without the wear and tear of living on the spot. She answered that it was necessary to live among the people one professed to help. "You must suffer from the dirty streets," said Kelly, "the universal ugliness, the lack of oxygen in the air you daily breathe, the endless struggle with soot and dust and insufficient water supply, the hanging from a strap of the overcrowded streetcar at the end of your day's work. You must send your children to the nearest wretchedly crowded school and see them suffer the consequences, if you are to speak as one having authority. And these matters of the common daily life and experience." The settlement house movement spread quickly. In 1891, the United States had 6 settlements. In 1897, it had 74. Many settlement house workers like Florence Kelly and Jane Addams at Hull House worked not only for local improvement, but also for broader political change. And now the muckrakers. And this is going to be part of your assignment about the muckrakers. The muckrakers. Progressive reformers also included investigative journalists, newspaper and magazine writers who aimed to expose corruption in politics and business. In a speech in 1906, President Theodore Roosevelt acknowledged the need for the relentless exposure and attack upon every evil practice, whether in politics, business, or social life. The president said, "I hail as a benefactor every man who in a book, magazine, or newspaper with merciless severity makes such attack, provided always that he is in turn remembers the attack is of use only if it is absolutely truthful." Roosevelt complained, however, that some writers engaged in indiscriminate assault and reported only on that which is vile and debasing. The president compared these writers to a character in John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, who could look no way but downwards with the muck rake in his hand. A muck rake is a tool for sifting through animal dung. The press began to apply the label of muckrakers to the writers who used their words to expose corruption, fraud, and injustice. While many muckrakers' exposés were melodramatic and exaggerated, some of their writings nevertheless led to government investigations and much needed reforms. And here is a meat packing plant, and the picture, the caption says, "Muckrakers revealed the unhealthy practices of meat packers." And it's pretty gross. And that is what we're going to read here shortly about Upton Sinclair in the jungle. He focused on the meat packing. But let's finish this column first. Jacob Riis's account of human misery in the city slums, How the Other Half Lives, published in 1890, was a forerunner of muckraking journalism. In 1902, S.S. McClure, whose McClure's magazine had one of the largest circulations in the country, brought muckraking to national prominence by running a series of articles exposing corruption in some of the nation's biggest businesses and city governments. Ida Tarbell, a McClure staff writer, wrote The History of the Standard Oil Company, which described John D. Rockefeller's ruthless attempts to destroy competitors of the Standard Oil Trust. Lincoln Steffens wrote a series of articles on political corruption in the cities, published in 1904 as a book, The Shame of the Cities. Fellow muckrakers David Graham Phillips and Burton Hendricks spotlighted corruption in the U.S. Senate and the life insurance industry. So these muckrakers, today we could maybe say they're kind of like 60 Minutes or Dateline. Those shows on TV that were the news, they'll highlight some problem or some situation and bring it to light so people know about it. But at that time, they didn't have TV, of course, so they relied on these magazines with large circulations like McClure's magazine. Okay, I'm going to stop here for this video before we go on to the jungle because I'm almost up out of my 15 minutes time. So we'll start with the next video with the jungle and Upton Sinclair.